eventually got it right with Enzo. So
Yeah.
yep, perfect. We are live. Let's just give it a couple of seconds for everyone to join in. And just 1 second. 0 viewers of right now, I think, which is probably me. I'll just give it a couple of seconds for.
Sure, yeah, no, of course. Like I said, I've probably got about an hour or so. I'm due to be doing another thing on. It was actually on the Women's Champions League that obviously happened yesterday and finished, and that was originally due to be at 5:30. But I sort of said, "Can we move that?" But
I'm
again,
so sorry.
I've got more availability.
I sort of wanted to confirm on the time zones, right? So,
Sure.
cool, guys. I think we've got a couple of viewers coming in. So, thank you so much, Rob, for joining. And I'm pretty sure everyone joining right now is familiar with Rob and his work, all round legend. And contrary to what a lot of people don't believe, I actually do know Rob personally. I'm happy to get him onto the stream. And thank you so much, Rob, for taking the time out. I know exactly how busy you are right now. It's a crazy busy time of the season. And thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, no, absolute pleasure. And again, I will always try and make time. As I've said this before, I will always try and make time for people. Increasingly, that is more difficult just due to the nature of how my life is shaping up and how things are going. But no, I'll always try and make time. And also, I do say it to everyone. If you have questions and stuff, you are welcome to DM them to me. I will try and respond. Within at least 12 working hours, as a general rule. But I do appreciate people's patience because sometimes, especially when a transfer breaks, you see I get the same DM 30 times asking if something's true, and it's it can be a little bit hard if I go back 30 times. I have to say to the same people, yes, this is true, yes, this is true, yes, this is true, 30 times in a row.
But yeah, I can testify. Rob is one of the most approachable journalists out there. So if anyone, and I think AS is one of those few people who isn't following you on Twitter, follow RJP journalism on Twitter.
I can't blame them. I do post a lot of stuff that does annoy people.
For sure, and that is Twitter. So. Cool, Rob. So I think we can probably start with the question that's on everyone's minds, right? I think we were just discussing this just before this stream started as well.
Mm-hmm.
Mason Mount. Where there's conflicting news flying around. Some people are saying it's a done deal that he's going to stay. Some people are saying it's still very fluid. So, and what does your gut say about the Mason Mount situation here?
So, from what I understand in the situation, there's a lot more positivity now around the entire stance and around how everything is sort of looking compared to, say, a month ago. There have been positive conversations on the club side with Mason Mount regarding him staying. A lot of it is mainly due to the fact that there's a real push from the ownership to try and retain him. Certainly, there's nothing agreed and decided at this moment in time, both in terms of him staying or in terms of him going. I think it's very important to stress this is a fluid situation. He is someone who Mauricio Pochettino absolutely adores. Posh has made it very, very clear he thinks he's a phenomenal player. He would like to keep the player. When he was at PSG, there were some exploratory, looks at trying to poach the player from PSG and poach the player when he was at PSG. He's someone who Pochettino, I think, very much sees as someone who he wants to use in his squad. And Pochettino has been very open when talking to the club about a belief that the transfer strategy in recent years has been focused around buying players that haven't necessarily been required when there have been suitable players in the youth systems or suitable players in the squad. He obviously was very, very successful at Tottenham of doing this and using players that were brought through either the academy or alternatively were brought for sort of cheap fees. So I think certainly at this moment in time it looks more positive. The caveat I will give to all of this is ultimately there is a number that Mason Mount has in his head of what he's worth. And I am not going to go out and say a player is not worth X, a player is not worth Y. Again, I tend to avoid football finances, as you know, because I find them baffling. And, I find it very, very hard to sit and say, oh, X player's worth 300 grand a week. I don't think anyone really is. But he has a figure in his mind, and obviously it's up to the club to reach that and to reach some sort of amicable agreement. And the biggest sticking point with the previous negotiations were the length of contract. The club want to try and tie players down to long-term contracts. You're talking, 6+ years. Now, if Mount at the moment, originally they made him offers for an 8-year contract. If Mount did sign that, it would take him all the way through to sort of 31, 32, and that leaves him very little leverage for discussing another contract. I think if there's going to be a positive outcome to this, I would imagine what you might see is he might sign a 3-year extension maybe, which gives him leverage when he's effectively coming into his prime. It also gives him a bit of time to try and regain his form, as per se. So certainly at this moment in time, I'd maybe put a 60% chance on him renewing. I think it's more positive than it is negative, but at the same time, nothing is like done. And I want to like stress, I know there have been reports suggesting, maybe something's been formally offered, etc. To the best of my knowledge, nothing has been formally offered. The club would like to keep him. The ownership have made it very clear to the player. Pochettino would like him to keep him. I don't know if there have been those conversations yet, because obviously Posh has not officially joined yet. But until those conversations happen, it means that everything else I say, if I was to say one way or another that X is definitely going to happen or Y is definitely going to happen, it would just be me guessing. And that's not fair.
For sure. And I think great question from a very good friend of ours, member of the Chelseakaaran community. And I think it's like a segue into the next segment, right? There's been all these news around Pochettino. I think you were the first person to tell me. I was going around, sort of trying to get a sense of who the next manager would be, and you said it's going to be Poch. I was like, I'm sure there's going to be no deviation from this, but we still haven't seen the official announcement come in, and I think that's creating a bit of unease in people's minds. So, what's your sense?
I wouldn't so much worry about that. Like, Pochettino is someone who, firstly, is very, very thorough with all his contractual work. He will want to make sure agreements are in place. He will want to know he's sorting. Secondly, he actually doesn't have an agent. He manages everything himself. And so consequently, he tends to also manage contracts with his own staff himself as well. And so, as I always say to people have a warped view of how transfers work and how hiring and firing works because of the fact, there are certain football simulation games where you offer a bit of money, you sit down, thrash out a contract, and suddenly, it's done. In reality, you have to remember that these people, they're not robots. They have human lives. You have to talk to your family about it. You have to discuss relocating. You have to find a house. You have to work out what you're going to do. You have to find schools for your children, etc., etc. And there is a lot of stuff that, people don't really encounter. I expect maybe to see more definitive movement, I think, on Pochettino probably in the next sort of couple of days. I think we're getting to a point where the club feel prepared to make some sort of formal offer now and make some sort of formal agreement. Maybe it might even happen as early as tomorrow after Arsenal. I think, there was certainly some feeling internally within the club that they want the process to be extensive, and that's partly why, Julian Nagelsmann ruled himself out of it, because he was less keen, shall we say, on an extensive process compared to some of the other managers. In terms of Harry Kane, it's an interesting one, and it'd be very, very interesting because there's a lot of schools of thought here. I know certainly for a fact Thomas Tuchel would like to take him to Bayern Munich, and Bayern Munich themselves are looking for a number 9. However, he's going to be very, very expensive, and it's whether Bayern have that money. That said, they are a cash-rich club, so, I would probably put them and Manchester United are the two top ones. Manchester United like the player. They view him in a similar mould to how they took Teddy Sheringham, and they see him as being someone that, can really lead the line, play off Rashford as he's done for the national side. And sort of, there's a feeling internally within Manchester United that Tottenham, if they had to sell the player, would rather sell him to Manchester United or indeed to Manchester City than they would ever entertain selling him to Chelsea. Now, I think Pochettino would like to bring the player to Chelsea. I think he's someone who he does really rate, and it gives it certainly more of a chance. But I think saying more of a chance is being very, very generous. I think we'll like hell is going to freeze over before Daniel Levy and the Tottenham hierarchy sell Harry Kane to Chelsea, purely due to the fact of the animosity it will cause the fans. They are not popular owners anyway. There have been a lot of, obviously, unrest at Tottenham, as much so there probably as there has been at Chelsea this season. And in a way, it has really sort of maybe been hidden a little bit this season. So I think certainly Pochettino gives a slight better chance. But then again, I think the chances, you're more likely to see Chelsea successfully announcing the cloning program for Didier Drogba is complete, and re-announcing the signing of 24-year-old Drogba than they are to see Harry Kane line up in a Chelsea shirt. The only caveat I would say with all of this is that Kane is out of contract in 18 months. And if it did get through this summer and he hadn't signed a new deal, I could very much see him going on a free transfer in 18 months' time. And in that case, I think it will just be whoever makes the best package offer. Now, there's a few schools of thought again here. Where will Chelsea be in 18 months' time? They will have Broja and Datro Fofana, who are two players who they have very, very high hopes for as the striking position. There is also an expectation the club will look to bring in a 9 this summer, so the need may be lesser. Certainly, in the next few years, Paris Saint-Germain are going to need to restructure and revamp their attack. Real Madrid would like to do it with Erling Haaland, but again, at this moment in time, Manchester City are very, very keen to try and retain Haaland and, offer him the earth. If Haaland did end up going from Manchester City to, say, Real Madrid in 2 summers' time, I think they would look at Kane as a replacement. Benzema is not getting any younger. Barcelona, although they're not cash rich in terms of transfers, they have flexibility with wages. Robert Lewandowski will also be another year older. They will have those significant wages off the wage bill. So I think if it does get under a free transfer, then Chelsea have as good a chance as anyone. But I think it's very, very unlikely Tottenham will let it get to that stage. I think what's most likely going to happen is he'll be sold this summer, probably to Manchester United.
Oh, well, that's depressing for sure.
I promised you the most accurate stuff, not necessarily the answers you want to hear.
For sure. But just thinking of the best striker in the league going to United, and club that I hate, is a bit disappointing there for sure.
I mean, the best striker in the league won't be going to Manchester United because Erling Haaland won't be joining Manchester United.
But for me, I still put Kane above Haaland, bro. But
that's a conversation for another time. No, I think it's interesting because again, I'm also told privately, and this is sort of more of from a player point of view, I'm told Kane does regret the fact that he didn't make that move to City a few years ago and didn't make it happen, because obviously Haaland is now there and that door is closed. I think he's confident that, he knows in his heart that a move to Chelsea or Arsenal will not materialise. And that kind of almost only leaves Liverpool, who are unlikely to pay the transfer fee, and Manchester United in England. One thing I am told about Harry Kane is that people did say they see it perhaps hard to see him leaving England because he's very much someone who's settled in England. And a lot of the time people fail to factor this into transfers. Sometimes players are interested in moving, but it doesn't always happen. I'm sorry that I'm speaking in English. I do apologise. I don't know if you want to briefly translate what I've said.
I think too much effort, but we did call this out. We do English content as well, and sorry, but subtitles real time are a bit of a challenge. We'll try and plug them in later on.
Yeah, sure.
But I think I think that's sort of a segue into our next question, right? Chelsea doesn't need a striker in 18 months. I think a lot of our subscriber base as well as the general fan base has had they have their frustrations with Havertz, to say the least. He was bought in and we were promised the sky and the moon, but we haven't gotten, we did get a big trophy out of it, but he hasn't performed, and that's putting it lightly. Out of, let's say, people like Osimhen and Vlahovic, whose names were bandied about, is there a realistic option that you think we've already spoken to, or have we laid the groundwork for a striker deal there?
Right. So, I mean, obviously, I will say the club are in active talks with a lot of players at this moment in time. I'm not going to pretend they're not, and they are scouting and looking around. The striker market this summer is probably the smallest that it's ever been, with maybe, I'd say, 3 big names coming to the top of everyone's shortlist in the forms of Vlahovic, Osimhen, and Ivan Toney for the English clubs. Now, I'll deal with Ivan Toney first. Brentford would accept an offer for Ivan Toney if it was above, I think, 60 million. 70 million. They would bank on their recruitment team, their phenomenal recruitment team at Brentford, being able to, replace the player. The biggest caveat with Toney at the moment is no one exactly knows when the FA are going to rule on his betting charges and how they are going to rule. If I look at Kieran Trippier, for example, for a much lesser and minor indiscretion, Trippier got a 3-month ban.
Oh, wow.
When Joey Barton was convicted for betting offences, he got an 18-month ban. Both of these cases are significantly lesser than what Tony is being charged with. Now, I don't necessarily think they will want to try and ruin his career. I think, the FA will try and mitigate it, and I suspect you'll probably see it go to an appeal. But I would be amazed if you're not looking at something like a 9 to 12-month ban for Ivan Toney, due to the fact the FA want to approach betting charges and want to make it a sort of, a real deterrent against them. And also the fact that they've now announced the issues with, removing betting sponsorship. They want to be seen to be taking a hard line against betting. So a lot of clubs are hedging their bets on that. And indeed, Brentford themselves internally, that's why Brentford went out and got Kevin Schade sorted. That's why they've got Mikhail Damsgaard in. That's why Brian Mbermo signed a new deal. That's why they're looking at other strikers, because they know at some point that this big hammer is going to drop on them. And Ivan Toney is so integral to the way they play. He's so consistent for them, not just in terms of his goal scoring, but in terms of his ability to lead the line. It's going to be something that they need to, work out very carefully. Now, Brentford do have a very, very good track record of replacing strikers. Again, if I go back, I have had a soft spot for Brentford for over 10 years. Again, they used to be my little local club in League One that I used to go and watch. It's very strange seeing them in the Premier League. But going back as far as 10 years ago, they had Charlie McDonald up front, who they replaced with Clayton Donaldson. Then they replaced Clayton Donaldson with the Irish Shepherd, Scott Hogan. Then they replaced Scott Hogan a few years later with Nail Mopay. Then they replaced Nail Mopay with Ollie Watkins. And then they replaced Ollie Watkins with Ivan Toney. Consistently, they've been able to upgrade on their strikers. That's been the most impressive thing. Consistently, they've done it. So I think there'll be a lot of clubs looking at Ivan Toney this summer. Tony's biggest thing will be he will want assurances on game time, and he'll want assurances on minutes. So I do think that probably rules out any of the sides, the likes of Arsenal, for example, that are looking at him as backup to Gabriel Jesus. I think he's unlikely to say, yes, I'll take that, unless it's an offer that he really, really wants. Obviously, he is an Arsenal fan. It has been documented he is an Arsenal fan before, but he has also said that he doesn't really factor that into his mode of thoughts. So that probably sums up Ivan Toney quite well. Moving on to Dusan Vlahovic. Vlahovic is part of a Juventus sort of situation that it's a bit of a state of limbo. They are doing well on the pitch at this moment in time, but Max Allegri is very much split the dressing room. There are a lot of very unhappy players at the club, and I suspect Juventus are going to act and change manager again sooner rather than later, regardless of how the season ends. Now, Dusan Vlahovic, when he actually joined Juventus, there was a lot of interest from England. There was a lot of interest from Arsenal. Vlahovic's representation is complicated because it has ties to the Serbian mafia. And there are some quite...
I didn't know this.
Yeah, there are some quite shady aspects about Dusan Vlahovic's representation. There are also a significant number of, and I use the phrase representatives very loosely here, that will want their slice of the pie, and the chance of a whacking great Premier League contract will be appealing. That said, Dusan Vlahovic has really struggled at Juventus this season. After an okay first year, he has really, really struggled. Juventus themselves have struggled to score goals on a consistent basis, and it's quite clear that he is not happy, along with Fede Chiesa, Angel Di Maria, a number of players at the club. I suspect that Juventus will try and retain Vlahovic and try and push the value up, unless they get a offer that's either way above valuation or they get some sort of loan with an obligation to buy. One of the big things about Italian football is it's not cash rich. So clubs will often try and only accept deals where there are extensive caveats in it or extensive options, but they will at the same time try and sell players and ensure that they can get the cash up front as soon as possible. There is also a lot of internal dealing, as you saw with Vlahovic when Fiorentina signed him. There was a lot of, Italian clubs do like to sell to other Italian clubs because they don't like the league getting weaker, because they see that as being a big issue. And there is certainly a bit of a complex among Italian clubs. They resent the fact that the Premier League has especially become so cash rich. Because, again, the Italian league ruled in the 90s, and leagues do go through periods of cyclical leadership. But the Italian league, there's always been a real bone of contention. about it. I think if Vlahovic asks to leave, then Juventus won't stand in his way as long as the club offers the right amount of money. But again, it's a lot of money for someone who's coming into it who's very out of form.
I'm not a huge fan of Vlahovic. He feels very, one-footed, right? On the left, he's a
Yes.
beast, but push him onto the right, he's always a bit.
Yes, very, very one-footed. I will say that Dusan Vlahovic is someone who I think is... I've watched him a lot, and I just don't feel I don't feel that looking at him as a striker, he's the sort of player that I look at every game and think, yeah, you're going to score every single game. And I appreciate not every striker can do that, but a lot of strikers have that feeling for it. Like, one of the best examples I use is like Callum Wilson at Newcastle. Callum Wilson, even though he doesn't score every game, he has that aura and that sort of way about him that he always looks like, if you gave him a chance, you'd expect him to finish it. Vlahovic, especially since Christmas, has looked devoid of confidence. He's missed several penalties in that period. He's subsequently stepped off taking penalties. He's missed a lot of very easy chances. And he does very much look like a confident striker. Now, I suppose the flip side to this is that if you get Vlahovic and you can get him confident and you can get him, playing well, then you potentially get a bargain. But I don't think they will really entertain that. And then finally, you come on to Victor Osimhen, who I think kind of is the big striker target for the summer for a lot of clubs. PSG have long-term interest in the player dating back to when he was at Lille. Bayern Munich would like to bring in a new striker, and Osimhen is someone who they have identified. Chelsea really like Victor Osimhen. Again, their interest in the player dates back to his time at Wolfsburg and also his time at Lille. He's someone who they've had long eyes for and long had eyes for. Arsenal considered Victor Osimhen last summer before moving for Gabriel Jesus. Manchester United like Victor Osimhen. Napoli are notoriously difficult to deal with. And Napoli, from their perspective, they will have a price in mind and it will not budge. Osimhen has a fairly long contract at the club. They are not interested in that regard. That said, I do think the fact that they have won the title this year, it's practically a formality that they're going to wrap up the title. And the fact that they won't be selling Kvaratskhelia unless someone makes a very, 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 very over-the-top offer, I think means that Osimhen is the next one that they're looking at in the line of sale. There's also a feeling internally that Osimhen himself might like to try something different and might like to go and try a new league. At this moment in time, nothing is decided with Victor Osimhen. Representatives are innumerous, and there are a number of them that have given him different opinions and different views. Napoli themselves have not formally really invited any conversations for the player. They don't intend to formally invite conversations for him until the season is concluded. I suspect this will likely end up being the summer's big auction. There will be a lot of clubs, throwing bids in. Certainly, I think you're probably looking at least 120 million euros to make something happen, to have good conversations. He is not going to be cheap.
I think they bought him for around 80 million, if I'm not wrong.
About 80, yeah. Technically, it was about 60 million euros plus 20 million in add-ons. However, one of the other caveats with Osimhen's deal is it's currently being investigated by the French football authorities and also the Italian football authorities due to tax irregularities and irregularities in the initial purchase. And so, consequently, Victor Osimhen could face a ban from the World Footballing Authorities, depending on what the outcome of that case is. Now, that case has rumbled, I think, now for 18 months, 2 years, and they are no closer to an outcome. So I don't necessarily think suddenly we're going to see an outcome on it, but undoubtedly there will be a feeling in the back of the minds that clubs need to be aware of this. And the other thing, Chelsea, one thing I will say in Chelsea's favour in this regard is that Chelsea did work last summer with the new ownership to try and improve historically frosty relations with Napoli. Certainly, Roman Abramovich and Marina Granovskaya did not enjoy the best relationship with Aurelio De Laurentiis. The new owners did work very hard to try and improve that, especially during the Koulibaly deal, which ultimately I think, the club has come to regret, I think is the right phrase for it, due to the nature of elements of that deal. But certainly, I think it's more feasible to see Chelsea being able to sit down and put a decent offer in for Osimhen. But again, a lot of it will depend on where the finances are elsewhere, and what money is actually available for summer, who goes and who stays.
And with finances, I think one position that everyone wants us to spend money on is midfield, right? And we have this question from Football for Planet again. I think we've chased Declan Rice for longer than most of his girlfriends have, but and there's also names like you have Ugarte, who CFC Central, a close friend of ours, is a huge fan of.
Oh, I know he loves the man. Again, I often get texts from him at 5 a.m. just telling me he can't stop thinking about Ugarte's interceptions.
Yeah, but that's suspicious considering Central does have a girlfriend. I should probably let her know, but still. So what are your thoughts on this? And I think our subs sort of know that I have this very emotional connect to Koulibaly, so hearing that the ownership regrets buying him is a bit of a bummer for me. But he was one of my favorite players when he was at Napoli, but understandably he's regressed a bit.
I will say in terms of that, it's more like a case of that a lot of them feel, I think, a lot of them feel that they feel that due to his age and things, he hasn't necessarily brought in the leadership that they were hoping for, and other players haven't developed in the same way. Players maybe out on loan have developed better. There have been, other decisions to bring in other centre backs into the club. It kind of feels a bit like, money that could have been spent elsewhere. And it ultimately, I don't necessarily, it's all completely down to his fault. I think there's, a number of reasons why, but it'd be interesting to see what happens in the summer. Because again, there are a lot of interest from Italian clubs, but they are not cash rich. Going on to the defensive midfield position, I think Declan Rice is very unlikely to happen. I think West Ham will demand a fee that Chelsea just won't pay this summer. I think if they do get Europa League football through winning the Conference League, they may try and persuade him to stay. Certainly, there is interest from North London in the player. He is one of their priority targets for the summer. Again, Rice's big thing will be going somewhere and making sure that he does play and making sure that he does start. There are factors at Arsenal that we shouldn't really go into here that may mean that an opportunity becomes available to start more consistently in their midfield. At the same time, there's long-term interest in the player from Manchester United. Manchester City are looking to move on Calvin Phillips, and so have a midfield spot that becomes open. I suspect they may look to Declan Rice, as I think Jude Bellingham is going elsewhere. So I think you're then maybe moving on to the next option. Manuel Ugarte, there's a lot of clubs that have scouted him. There is concerns from a few scouts, including a couple I've spoken to, that although he fits very, very well in Sporting structure and does very, very well in the way Sporting play, very few sides play in a similar manner in the Premier League, and opposition sides don't necessarily play in the same way. For Lavia, the club are waiting to see exactly what happens with Southampton and if they go down, because they think they can get him as a lower cost. There is ultimately a buyback clause with Manchester City, but that doesn't come into effect until next summer. And so I think this summer you'll see a lot of clubs maybe trying to jump the gun on that one and maybe try and intercept that part of the deal. Again, the wild card would be that if City do manage to sell Calvin Phillips, they might just bite the bullet and pay, the return clause for Lavia. Certainly, Chelsea have liked Romeo Lavia for a long, long time. This dates back to his time at the youth spell in City and indeed when he was a young player in Belgium. But I think that he's the most likely at the moment. The next one would probably be Kwadwo Kone. Kwadwo Kone has privately made it very, very clear he'd like to move to Chelsea or to PSG, and has made it very, very clear to his representatives if either of those come up, he wants to take it. Gladbach themselves, again, are not cash rich. They are expecting to move on a number of players this summer, and indeed, they have to sort of accommodate around that Marcus Thuram will likely leave on a free transfer because he's out of contract, and they failed to extend this deal at this moment in time. Ideally, Gladbach would like him to extend for 1 year to profiteer him effectively because they know he's not going to stay for the long period of time. They have other players at the club as well, like Joe Scally, who they know have maybe struggled in recent weeks, but have had, I suppose, issues off the pitch as well that they've had to encounter for, but they could raise good funds. If I was to guess, I think it will be Romeo Lavia, on the basis that I think the club in general want to try and make the midfield younger. Partly why they accepted the offer of Jorginho. Right? Sorry,
did we not bid for him last summer? I think that
we did make an offer for him after he joined Southampton as well. Yeah, I will couch it also by saying that people talk about the defence midfielder. Andre Santos is very, very well liked by the club. The club were very, very unhappy that he wasn't allowed to stay at the club until the summer. They planned on bedding him in over these last 6 months and playing him more and more. That's partly the reason why Jorginho was allowed to leave. That was never part of the Enzo Fernandez deal. They were looking at, Enzo separately, but Jorginho was allowed to go because they thought Andre Santos could step straight into the breach. I would be amazed at this moment in time if Chelsea aren't calling Andre back for day one of pre-season and breaking the loan deal, as they have the option to do. They were very keen to include this clause in it. By all accounts, he's playing very, very well in Brazil, and he's someone who the club feel can step in and make a real early difference. Other wild card names, and they're not going down. Someone says about Kovacic to City. I think Mateo Kovacic will leave the club this summer. I think ultimately it's just coming to a natural end, and I think that there is a lot of interest in him. Manchester City, again, see him as an option to Jude Bellingham. There is still interest from Inter Milan in bringing him back. Paris Saint-Germain have long-term interest in the player. It wouldn't be completely out of the question if Real Madrid did look at him, depending on what happened with Modric and Toni Kroos, because they have, always felt that he was the longer-term successor option. I think, again, Chelsea are happy to probably get a good fee for the player this summer on the basis they want to try and make the midfield younger and also maybe make the midfield a bit stronger. And there's also a feeling internally that perhaps due to injuries and loss of form, that Kovacic maybe is actually sort of hitting his peak at this moment in time and maybe has peaked a bit earlier than expected. Again, his performances have been somewhat erratic over the last certainly 12 months, probably 18 months. And internally, I am also told that there's always been a bit of a frustration with Kovacic over the lack of the end product. Aesthetically, always been a very, very pleasing footballer and clearly a very good player. But, not the sort of midfielder Chelsea perhaps become accustomed to, who's chipping in with regular goals and assists.
He's probably my favorite player in the squad. But, it's always felt like he's never hit those heights that he was capable of and, which we thought he would when he was at Inter. So.
Yeah. And this is, I think, the issue is that Kovacic is clearly a very, very good footballer. But I don't necessarily think he's the right footballer for Chelsea's system at the moment. And someone also mentions Cesare Casadei there. Cesare Casadei has done well on his loan. I wouldn't necessarily expect him to step straight into the breach in the summer, but I do know that they do really like him at the club. They view him as someone who has unique attributes as a midfielder. And if they can, bring him in and he does well in pre-season, there's no reason he can't end up staying around next season.
This is one left field, rumor we've been hearing over the past couple of days.
Yeah,
right?
it's nonsensical. It is nonsensical. It stems from the fact Bayern Munich would like to move the player on. Chelsea did have interest in the player when Thomas Tuchel was at the club, because Thomas Tuchel really liked Sadio Mane before the last couple of weeks. But the issue with Mane and Sane has meant ultimately that Bayern, because they're a German club, they're always going to side with the German international. No one quite knows exactly what's gone involved in it. It's nonsensical. Loic Openda, Chelsea scouted the player, but I don't think it goes any further than that. Incidentally, he was on Brighton's list before behind João Pedro as one of their potential striker signings. He's someone who a lot of clubs have looked at, but the concern is, will he be able to step up to do it at a very top club? So far, he has, been very comfortable in his, in his bubble, but not necessarily been able to step up. I'm just going to sneeze for a second. Just go off camera. Apologies to everyone who had to hear that. Going to the Santos's work permit. Everything was fine with Santos's work permit in January. It was rejected under absolutely ludicrous grounds that the club went and then took a complaint to the, have complained to the FA about it. And the FA came out and said, actually, this is wrong. We shouldn't have disapproved this. But by this point, they couldn't register him anyway. Benjamin Sesko, someone asked about him. He's going to join RB Leipzig in the summer. If a club pays, stupid amounts of money, I suspect Leipzig will let him go immediately. But given the fact that they know Christoph Nkunku is leaving, sooner rather than later, it suggests to me that they probably won't immediately sell him unless someone, if someone offers 100 million for him, then I suspect they'll say thank you very much for a very, very unproven player at this moment in time.
And that announcement is because Nkunku wants to be respectful to the Leipzig fans, right?
Yes,
he is come to Chelsea.
It's all done, and I think the manager actually, he let it slip the other day. Everything is done paperwork wise. Everything is fine. It's just a case that Leipzig and Chelsea both agreed that they want to wait until the end of the season. At the time when it was discussed, Leipzig also were in multiple European competitions, and also so were Chelsea in a European competition. And also the fact that Leipzig still have stuff to play for in the league, they want to feel like that he has full focus on them until the end of the season. Ian Maatsen, Lewis Hall, I think will sign a new deal. I think he might go out on loan next season. Incidentally, I wouldn't be surprised to see him involved in the squad tonight. He's someone who the club rate very, very highly. Ian Maatsen's a more interesting one. He's had a really, really good loan spell, to the point that Burnley already, said we'd like to buy the player. And indeed, they are not alone. There are a number of clubs across Europe and in the Premier League. Leicester, if they stay up, have also made inquiries about buying Maatsen. I think ultimately Chelsea will probably hedge their bets on this one, and they will try and sell the player with a buyback clause on the basis that they know that in the medium term, one of Cucurella or Chilwell will leave the club. I think, if they got the right offer for Marc Cucurella in the summer, the player is not necessarily particularly happy at the moment at Chelsea. He is struggling with form, with confidence. I think if the club got an offer in the summer that was maybe, let's say, 2/3 of what they paid for, or sort of, 40 million, 30 million, they would strongly consider it on the loan deal that Maatsen's had. At the same time, Maatsen is completely unproven at the moment in the Premier League, and there have been concerns about his lack of physicality and about, his height. That said, that hasn't really been a problem in the Championship, which is generally more physical, but also Burnley have been so utterly dominant, it's hard to really judge, players fairly because they've been so good.
When you think about Burnley, right, was Company actually considered for Chelsea? I think that freaked a lot of people out, the news of him potentially.
I would say, they considered that there were a lot of managers on the long list, and there were a lot of managers that the club considered. That said, there were a lot of names that came out there that had absolutely no grounding or backing other than the point they said, what about X, Y, and Z? And that's all I really can say on this at the moment without getting into, things where I'd need to involve lawyers.
For sure. We'll stay clear of those topics, but I think this is one persistent question we've seen a few people ask. We did chase the player, we did scout him for a while. I think he spoke about wanting to come to Chelsea, and then
Arsenal Zakarian's a bit of a weird one in that there is interest in the players still. However, due to the nature of the political situation in Russia, Ukraine, it makes it very, very difficult. There are problems with getting finances to Russian clubs. There are problems with being viewed to have signed Russian players. I think ultimately this is possibly a ship that sailed with some of the other players that the club are looking at and some of the other options. Again, Zakarian was always viewed as being one of several options for that attacking midfield role, and it wouldn't surprise me if another one of them comes more to the fore. Now, ideally, I think what the club would really like, and this is unlikely at this moment in time, but ideally, I think they would really like him to leave the current club, maybe go somewhere for 6 months, and then be able to sign him from whatever that club is. But that's very, very hard to facilitate at this moment in time. And I think the ship has probably sailed.
Makes sense. I know, Rob, we've taken up a lot of your time, and I know it's a pretty busy day. So I think
I've probably got about 20 more minutes, I imagine, before I need to disappear off into my next venture.
Sounds good. Joao Felix, do you think it's possible that we do sign him on a permanent, or do you think another loan, or do we just cut all ties with?
I would be very, very surprised if with Joao Felix we didn't explore the opportunity, just by the fact we're exploring a lot of things at the moment. That said, I think the club would ideally, and what they are pushing for, is trying to get another loan deal in place. one of the biggest caveats with Joao Felix was who ended up in charge of Atletico Madrid next season, because it was looking originally that Diego Simeone might move on. And with the upturn in form, that now seems less likely. However, he still publicly hasn't confirmed or denied what his plans are for next year. Now, there's also a school of thought internally from the club that Felix is going to be extremely expensive. And is there that money, could it be spent better elsewhere? There's also been a bit of a feeling that maybe the last 6 months haven't been the ideal environment for the player, for whatever reason, due to the fact that Chelsea have struggled. And I think that they would maybe like to see him in a more settled side. Now, a lot of this will come down to what Pochettino wants, and what Pochettino decides. I think he will ultimately get the final say on people like Joao Felix. But at this moment in time, I think the club, if they could get another loan deal, they wouldn't be against it, seeing as they want to restructure the attack and move attackers on. But at the same time, I don't think they would want to do something that involved an obligation. I think they'd very much want something on their own terms.
Got it. Makes sense. And I know where you stand on Joao Felix, or has that opinion changed? Do you think he's worth the amount of money we'd invest in?
No. I think Felix is a Felix is consistently inconsistent, and that's my biggest problem. If you were telling me that you could get Felix consistently getting, goals and assists, I would be all for it, because I think he's a phenomenal footballer in terms of technical ability. I think he does have, great vision. He's got great passing. He can shoot. He's got a good turn of speed. He's got fantastic, dribbling ability. He can go around a player. That said, the problem is that far too often with Felix, you see one great game and then 5 pretty average games. And for a player of that price tag, and I said the same about Mikhailo Mudryk when we signed him, I said we'd overpaid for him. I said I wouldn't have paid that much. If you're paying that much, you want a ready-made, proven game changer. You want someone that's going to come in and, I'm talking like a De Bruyne, for example. A De Bruyne or, a Haaland who's going to come in and completely re-energize everything.
I think we're seeing a couple of questions about a new goalkeeper as well. I think it's been one position we haven't addressed.
Yeah, so again, this will probably be quite dependent on Pochettino and what he wants to do. The club have a few different situations they can go with a goalkeeper. Number one, they can try and move one of the 2 existing goalkeepers on. I suspect it'd be more likely to be Edouard Mendy, because he's on lower wages. He's got a shorter contract, and he generally is unhappy at the club at not playing. He wants to play on a regular basis. With the nature of Bayern Munich and Thomas Tuchel being there, the fact that Jan Sommer has struggled, and the fact that Manuel Neuer is not getting any younger, I would not be very surprised if they did make an offer for him in the summer, because the Jan Sommer experiment has failed quite spectacularly, and Neuer is not getting any younger, as I've said. There's also Alex Nurbal's made it clear he won't come back to be a number 2. It's not beneficial for his career to do that. So if they do sell Edouard Mendy, obviously then the club have to decide, do they go ahead and buy a definitive number 1 and make Kepa number 2 on the basis that Kepa doesn't want to be number 2, and in which case would probably also ask to leave the club? Or do they go and buy someone to pressure Kepa? At the same time, there's also Garga Slonina in the background, who the club fought very, very hard to beat Real Madrid, Bayern Munich, Wolves, to name a number of clubs that were interested in the player. And he's very, very highly regarded as a young goalkeeper. So there's a feeling they don't want to necessarily block his path. Now, what I think most likely will happen this summer is Chelsea will sell both Edouard Mendy and Kepa and buy a new goalkeeper. But I think if they do that, they will also then try and get a experienced goalkeeper in as the number 2, or maybe just promote Bettinelli as to number 2, in order to allow Garga Slonina to go out on loan for the year. They also have the various young goalkeepers, Nathan Baxter, Jamie Cumming, Eddie Beach, have all been out on loan, and potentially one of those could become 3rd choice quite easily, or maybe even 2nd choice in the case of Nathan Baxter, because they want to try and make sure that Slonina is playing regular minutes.
Got it. Makes sense. And I think we're seeing a lot of people potentially. I think we've discussed pretty much every position in the squad, right? We've covered our wide attackers. We've covered goalkeepers as well. And I think we discussed this before the stream. It's probably a touchy area with transfer embargoes, but outgoings. I think there are a few names where everyone knows what will happen. Azpilicueta is probably going to leave, and that's going to break my heart. Probably one of my favorite players ever, and that is a done deal, right? We are not going to offer him
I would say I'd say with Azpilicueta, I think the club will sit down, have an honest conversation with him in the summer. They wouldn't necessarily be against keeping the guy. I think as very much as like a squad player and as a player, just someone who they could keep around for good experience. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think they are aiming to do that. Obviously, with Malo Gusto coming in and Reece James being at the club, the right back slot is sort of sorted. As a centre back, he doesn't really fit in a 4 at the back system, which is what I think Pochettino may prioritise. He's maybe, only really now can play in that right centre back position. And I think the club will try and be respectful to him. And if, a club makes an offer for him and he wants to go, they would probably let him go on a free transfer.
Makes sense. And potential other outgoings, I think there's one player that a lot of people want to leave. And I had huge hopes when he came in, and that's Kai Havertz. So, do you think is there interest in Germany or?
There's a lot of interest in the player from a lot of clubs, but again, there's a feeling they want to see what Pochettino exactly wants to do. They feel that Havertz might be the sort of player that finally, if they change system and play in a 4-2-3-1, with him in behind the striker, that might be where they can finally get him thriving. There's also certainly a school of thought that perhaps this moment in time, his valuation is so low this summer, they're better off keeping him almost for one more year when he then still has 12 months left in his contract and trying to sell him next summer. He was someone that was always signed with a longer term intention in mind. I thought that, maybe he would take a little while to adapt. I think Chelsea, again, he's the sort of player that if they got the right offer for him, they wouldn't stand in the way, but they would want a significant amount of money because they know the likelihood is he's going to go somewhere and do very, very well.
Got it. And I think Kante, it is probably going to be the same as well, right? I think we looking
to
move him on?
Kante, the club have an offer on the table for him to renew. I think it will get signed. Again, I think if someone made a big offer in the summer, they'd still maybe consider it. But certainly, from the club's point of view, one of the big problems this season has been Kante's in unavailability for a lot of the year. They feel that he adds a lot to the midfield. He is, in someone's words, the best midfielder at the club. And I think they would like to try and keep him at least for one more year, just because the fact that even if you can get limited games out of him and you manage him better, maybe with, people like Andre Santos and coming into the squad, if you can get limited games out of him at his top level, then that is, better than nothing else. Charlie Webster is going to leave the club. He signed a extension, I think it was last summer, for 2 years, but he's made it very clear that he ultimately feels that he needs to go play regular minutes. He expects to start week in, week out for a club. That's what he wants to do. There's a lot of interest in Germany. The same with Charlie Patino at Arsenal and also Carlos Borges at Manchester City, some other good youngsters. I would be very, very surprised if you don't see Webster back at another Premier League side in the next few years. He's a phenomenal talent. This will probably be the one that got away for Chelsea. The only caveat I will say is that he has struggled at times this year to get consistency, but he is still very, very young. And you will inevitably find this with a lot of Premier League sides. There will increasingly be young players that choose to go abroad because of the opportunities that are presented to them.
Got it. I think, we're winding down to the end of our session. And again, Rob, thank you so much. I think I've stressed on this again. I know exactly how busy it is, especially with the amount of turmoil surrounding Chelsea right now. It's never a dull day being a Chelsea fan, for sure. And
no,
thank you.
Never boring.
Never boring being a Chelsea fan. And thank you so much for jumping in, and hopefully have you on more often. For sure, it's going to be a crazy transfer window, and all of Kerala is hooked on to RJP journalism's tweets. So
I'm delighted, and again, thank you very much for all the support.
Sure, thank you so much, and thank you everyone who participated in the comment section. This was great fun. Hopefully, we'll do this more often. Cool, guys. Thank you. Good night.
Cheers. Bye.